far away kind of, how do you change a system? Like, systems are designed not to be changed. So this is going to talk about some of the ways that we, as people who are involved in Youth for a United World, who share this culture of sustainability that's really evident in the EOC, can really push for system change. We can start to build that system change. So that's what I'm going to talk about a bit. So I need to change this on my computer and... Okay, so we've talked about the challenge. We've already heard this morning about the challenge of sustainable development. And what we're facing today in the world is, it's really a multiple challenges. It can be quite overwhelming because we're facing crises on so many different fronts. It's almost like firefighting. There's a crisis in terms of the basic question of feeding the world, in terms of the sustainability of food production, which is symbolised here by this young man in Southeast Africa. We're of course facing an ecological challenge of climate change, which I'm sure you're very conscious of. This is Typhoon Haiyan, which was the most powerful typhoon ever to hit land in the Philippines a few years ago. And the crisis of climate change is already impacting many countries in very direct ways, especially if you're a small island developing states, like this country, which is Nauru in the South Pacific, which is already facing sea level rises and the migration of many people. And in fact, you would be familiar yourselves with some of the other impacts of climate change in California, the whole crisis last year with the town of Paradise, and how the wildfires that are increasing in intensity and also increasing in frequency, longer fire seasons and so on. And this issue of migration as well, which is a driver, is being driven by ecological issues, but also driven by the other side of climate change, or ecological crisis, which is our economy, which is so unequal and unsustainable. And of course, one of the issues which is very much underpinning the ecological crisis, I've been told to go slower, is the whole question of biodiversity. And in fact, many people today don't only talk about a climate crisis. We have to talk about a crisis, an ecological, about a sustainability crisis, but a crisis of biodiversity loss and climate change. And they're very much interconnected, as I'll show. One statistic that wasn't shown before, which I think is very stark, which demonstrates the vast inequality in our world, which drives many of these other crises, is this one. This is from a couple of years ago, from an Oxfam report, that the 62 richest people on this planet have the same wealth as the 3.6 billion poorest people. And whilst the statistics around absolute poverty are rightly, as you said, decreasing, the levels of inequality, both inside countries and also between countries, are growing dramatically. And that's a huge challenge for us. So in 2015, the world governments really tried to face up to these issues. I'm sure some of you will remember this if you're aware of these of the whole question of sustainability. And the UN convened 3 conferences in 2015 to try and address this question of income inequality and what the drivers of that, and the ecological crisis we're facing. So there were 3 big events that year. I was involved in all 3 of them, which was very interesting. One was to look at how do we finance sustainable development, how do we address this question of how the world economy works. The second one you've already talked about, it was the decision to adopt 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And the third one was an important treaty signed in December 2015 called the Paris Climate Accord, Paris Agreement, where all governments in the world, all states, made individual commitments to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in order to prevent the warming of the earth, the further warming of the earth. But what is really interesting about this, what was agreed in 2015, and what we really need to think about, and somebody said again about thinking critically about these issues, is what's not included in these goals. These goals are wonderful and they're aspirational, and it's really important that we aspire to all of these development goals. But what's not included in these goals is really any mention of fossil fuels. In the whole of these goals, you don't mention the fossil fuel industry, which is quite surprising when they're the main cause of the climate emissions. There's no talk about this whole issue of tax havens. I don't know if people know what tax havens are. This is the place, there are physical places on Earth where very super rich people can pay no taxes. So if you already have a couple of billion, it's an entry ticket to go and put your money in some of these islands where you will not pay any tax. So whilst they were prepared to talk about sustainable development goals, they weren't prepared to say, okay, well, let's close down the tax havens that are enabling these 62 people to have the same wealth as the bottom 3.6 billion. And some of these issues have come out in these leaks that we see all the time now. I don't know if you're aware of some of these, where the likes of the WikiLeaks have kind of put out into the public arena some of these really sensitive documents where you can see what actually is happening behind the scenes around agreements and how these powerful people are managing to evade taxes and make sure that these really difficult issues don't ever we don't have development goals. Imagine if we had development goals on tax havens. Let's stop the tax havens and let's tax the super rich. Anyway, these are the things that we need to be thinking about critically, that it's not always that we can take them on face value. And I wanted to include this because this is, we talk about information, and there is such a thing as objective information. We maybe don't think about it so much, but there is such a thing as scientifically verifiable facts. And this graph here, or this image of the Earth, is from last Friday. Okay? And what this is taken is from a group called Climate Reanalyzer, and it gathers data from all the weather stations all over the Earth. And what I'd like you to just look at is this, if I can, where's my pointer? Hopefully this is a pointer, okay. Just here. This is the Arctic Circle. What do we usually associate the Arctic Circle with? Ice. Ice, cold, frost. Do you know what temperature it is on the Arctic Circle last Friday? 34 degrees Celsius. 93, 94 degrees Fahrenheit. Unfortunately, this information doesn't generally get into the public arena, but that is a very maybe unscientific way of saying it, but the way I like to say it is our Earth is on fire. If it's almost 100 degrees in the Arctic Circle and it's not even the middle of summer yet, we have a problem on our hands. So when it comes to sustainable development, and this is where I want to really talk in quite a deep way about these issues, we're facing quite a major, what I would say, what you could term a central transitional problem. What does that mean, a central transitional problem? It means that we've been thinking in ways up till now, Western European, Western North American culture, let's say, that are not, that we need to shift in a systemic way to get us into the frame, having the right kinds of solutions for these big issues like climate change, like inequality. Because we're not addressing them fast enough, in any way fast enough at the moment. We're tinkering around the edges. We're doing our recycling maybe, and we're doing all the we're doing some things, but we're not going to the heart of the problem. So the central transitional problem is what I describe like this. So this is what is taught in schools on sustainable development. Have you seen this before? Have you ever seen this Venn diagram? Okay? So this Venn diagram is taught in almost every school, third level college, as what we need to do to reach sustainable development. Okay? So we like to think of sustainable development, so harmonious, that whole thing of, I like that, the definition. Sustainable development is development which meets the needs of the present without compromising the needs of the future. So that's how we define it. So what this talks about, and even one of the videos we saw about Los Angeles is based on this. So this is basically sustainable development is like the sweet spot. If you talk about it, there's a sweet spot. And it's the sweet spot between economic development, social progress, and environmental responsibility. And if we managed to reach all three of those at the same time, we are on the path to sustainable development. Sound good? Yeah? It sounds good. It sounds like a great idea. It sounds like hard maybe, but we could do that. However, there's a bit of a problem with this. There's a bit of a logic problem with this diagram. Can anybody, let's see if anybody can think about each of those circles. Can anybody come up with what the logic problem is with that? You can't see it. You might want to sit round if you want to see. Nobody come up with the problem? What happens? So imagine this. Oh, who has the answer? Yeah.
Well, I think of it in the sense that economic development and growth only goes one direction, which means using more and more resources and raw materials, which the Earth only has a certain number and a finite number. So that doesn't really make sense in terms of environmental sustainability. Like, how can you? It kind of seems like an oxymoron to suggest that economic growth is compatible with environmental sustainability.
Okay, that's really good. So the model, let's say if you take economic growth as the only economic model, the only way of developing through a continuous growth, then you're going to use up all your environmental resources. That's a really good point. Anyone see anything else? No? Well, what if you were to take away the circle at the bottom? Just imagine you took away the environment. Can we have economic and social progress without an environment? No. If we don't have a planet, if we use up all those resources, and we don't have the planet anymore, if we destroy the planet, can we have economic and social progress? It's impossible. So really, really interesting thinking's gone on in this issue in recent times. And a different model's being proposed, just to kind of make us think more deeply about the fact that, exactly as, what's your name again?
Mark.
As Mark said, with no environmental resources, we have no society or economy, okay? So all things are not equal. And this model on the other side, it's called the donut model, is actually a more accurate representation of our, let's say, human development and sustainable development. So what does this one show? This is an integrated way of thinking. So on the outside, we have here it's called environmental ceiling. You could also call it our planetary boundaries. So it's basically using what the earth scientists, it's combining the thinking of earth scientists to say that we have 9 planetary boundaries. And these are real things. These are not imagination things. They're not made up. They are real existing boundaries. And as the town city as LA found, you can breach those boundaries. You can pollute the water, and then you need to take action to remediate the fresh water. You can pump greenhouse gases, and you raise the temperature of the earth. You can deplete the nitrogen in the soil, and then you deplete the ability of the soil to regenerate. So basically, this model is a different model of sustainable development, and it's much more thought-provoking because it actually forces us to say we need to live within our planetary boundaries, but we also need to live within, or let's say above, what is called a social foundation. So if you think it is between 2 different axes, we need to have a social foundation, which means that we all have enough access to those resources, but we also need to ensure that as a human society, we don't breach our planetary boundaries. I'll put it in an even simpler way. This is a donut, okay? It looks very tasty. It's probably really bad for you. Okay, but the donut, that's the donut. We as a human society, we first need to accept there is a donut. Okay, there is a donut. We only have one planet. The planet is the donut, okay? The planet has limits. We might not think it, but if you try to breathe underwater for any length of time, you'll start to realize that you do have limits, okay? There is such a thing as an atmosphere, and there is such a thing as water, and we need to re-educate ourselves to believe that we have limits. And we need to think, what are the critical shifts as a human race that we need to address to get back inside that lovely, fluffy centre of the donut? We can't continue to have an economic model which is honest, which is pushing us constantly to the boundaries. We need to put in place the governance and the politics and all these things to work for the greater good, the common good, the good of the whole donut. So those kind of things are things that protect the common good. Policies and politics that are designed for the protection of the planetary limits and the protection of the social floor. But we also need to invent grassroots. So we need a grassroots, market-driven institutions, new kinds of institutions, and the reform of the existing ones that put those institutions at the service of sustainability. And when you think about the climate, I would always say you have to start with how you decarbonise. You get those institutions off the heavy kind of resource-intensive fossil fuels that we are consuming as if there's no tomorrow. So I want to talk a little bit about Pope Francis. How many people have read this amazing document? Are you aware of Laudato Si? Put your hand up. It's not okay. Have you read Laudato Si? Okay. How many people know it exists? Okay, that's good. Have you heard anybody talk about it in your parish or in your local area? Okay. Laudato Si is a massive contribution that Pope Francis has made to this question of system change for sustainable development. And he says something, and I think the previous speakers were touching on this, that the cry of the earth, so this the cry of sustainability, is the cry of the poor. Okay? That's quite a big statement to make. But what he says is that we are facing a crisis today. What we're facing today is not two crises, because this is part of our problem, that we've always thought about things in two different brackets, and even in the area I work in, that on the one hand you have the ecology people who are like all about recycling and being nice to the earth, and then on the other camp you have all the people who are always about the poor, and we need to be caring for the poor. But actually, what Pope Francis says, in a very profound way, is that the root of this crisis is one. There's one root. And it comes from a mindset. A mindset that has been translated into a kind of logic in culture today, in mainstream culture today. So what he says is a strategy for real change calls for rethinking processes in their entirety. Again, back to the system change. How do you do that? How do you change a process in its entirety? For it's not enough to include a few superficial ecological considerations while failing to question the logic which underlies present-day culture. So he calls us back to thinking it's about a logic that's underpinning our culture that we need to change. So it's one crisis we're facing. And we need to address this crisis by looking at what he calls, another big term that he uses, an integral perspective. We need to look at things in an integral way that looks at the economic, the social, and the environmental. And it needs to be based primarily around a cultural change, a cultural shift. When I was a Gen, we used to talk about going against the current. Is that term still used? Yeah, do people still talk about going against the current? This is what Pope Francis is talking about. He says, it's so hard today because this culture, which I'm going to explain in a lot more detail, is so prevalent in our society and in our social media that to change it, you need to be counter-cultural. I love that. I thought this is made for the young people. This is made for the Gen. Because being counter-cultural is exactly what, let's say, the start of the Focolare and Chiara and our companions and all those people, that's what they tried to do. And that's the message that they kind of gave to us, was to be, you need to have your own culture. And if people don't like it, you go, so what? This is what I do. This is what I do. This is our way. Youth for a United World stand for this kind of culture. He talks about it. We talked about consumerism. He talked about the idea that less is more. I love that idea. Less is more. And then an ecological conversion that puts the poor at the centre. So now I want to throw the question out to you before I talk more. What do you think are the prevailing mindsets? So what are the mindsets that you counter in your everyday life that are driving unsustainable processes and policies and lifestyles? So what I maybe ask you to do is just to kind of buzz for a few minutes with the person sitting next to you. And just think about it. Where do you come across these unsustainable? I don't mean kind of at the level of, oh, we don't recycle. But what are the drivers? What is it that you find in your daily life that kind of pushes you to be unsustainable? Where do you find that kind of impetus to be I'm not suggesting you're unsustainable, but I'm talking about the wider kind of society. Where's that impetus coming from? So maybe you could buzz about that for a few minutes and then we'll kind of have a bit of a discussion.
Yeah.